Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. Napoleon's Italian campaign was his debut on the world stage, taking command of a ragged army devoid of hope and transforming it into a victorious fighting force, which in less than 1 year would defeat no less than 6 successive enemy armies, despite the French being constantly outnumbered. The fortress of Mantua had now fallen. The Austrians were driven from Italy, and the Pope had been brought to heel. Still, Austria refused to make peace with France and gathered her seemingly inexhaustible resources for another try. Napoleon decided to march directly on Vienna, aiming to bring Austria to the peace table. In a series of successful conflicts, the French were about to drive their Austrian opponents back step by step until the gates of Vienna itself were within sight. It was a bold enterprise. Napoleon prepared to cross the rugged summits of the Carnic Alps, to plunge with an army of 50,000 men into the heart of one of the most powerful empires on the globe, containing 20 million people. But before he could do this, Napoleon had to make a sure ally of Venice. Napoleon warned the Venetian government, "Your whole territory is imbued with revolutionary principles. One single word from me will incite a blaze of insurrection through all your provinces. Ally yourself with France. Make a few modifications in your government, such as are indispensable for the welfare of the people, and we will pacify public opinion and will sustain your authority." But the aristocracy of Venice refused to ally with him and still claimed neutrality, although at the same time they were secretly raising an army of 60,000 men ready to fall on the French as soon as Napoleon's back was turned. "Be neutral then," Napoleon concluded, "but remember, if you violate your neutrality, if you harass my troops, if you cut off my supplies, I will take ample vengeance. I march upon Vienna. Conduct which could be forgiven were I in Italy will be unpardonable when I am in Austria. The hour that witnesses the treachery of Venice shall terminate her independence." Wintry storms were still howling around the summits of the Alps, and it was not thought that Napoleon would try to march through them. But he could not afford to wait. Otherwise, the Austrians would gather even more forces. Belatedly, Napoleon's victories persuade his own government, the French Directory, to back him in full. French armies stuck on the Rhine are now ordered to send him reinforcements. Their 34-year-old commander is General Bernadotte, another rising star of the French army. Born in Gascony, Bernadotte was at first apprenticed to be a lawyer, but at 17 his father died, prompting him to join the army. By 1785 he had been promoted to sergeant, was known for his strict discipline, and his tall appearance and fine dress earned him the nickname Sergeant Beaujambe, Fairlegs, from his men. He became known for daring assaults and fiery gasconades. To inspire his troops, once Bernadotte rallied his men who were retreating by tearing off his epaulets from his shoulder, throwing them to the ground, and shouting, "If you dishonour yourselves by flight, I refuse to remain your colonel." Then the soldiers rushed towards him, gathered up his epaulets for him, reformed in their ranks, and counterattacked. At the famous Battle of Fleurus in June 1794, Bernadotte had led a brilliant attack against the Austrians, winning him promotion to brigadier general on the spot. A meteoric rise for a man who had begun that year as just a captain. It was now that Napoleon first met Bernadotte, beginning a complicated and tumultuous relationship. Both men eyed each other as rivals from the start. "That man has a French head and a Roman heart," Napoleon said of him. "He is a Republican grafted onto a French cavalier." While Bernadotte remarked that Napoleon was a young man of 25 years old who assumes the airs of a man of 50, and in my opinion, that does not bode well for the Republic. Before setting off to march into Austria, Napoleon, as always, issued a proclamation to his troops. "Soldiers, the campaign just ended has given you imperishable renown. You have been victorious in 14 pitched battles and 70 separate actions. You have maintained the army during the whole campaign. Not only has the countryside nourished you, but you have been paid. In addition to this, you have sent 30 millions to the public treasury and have enriched the Museum of Paris with 300 masterpieces of ancient and modern Italy, which it has taken 30 centuries to produce. You have conquered the finest countries in Europe. The kings of Sardinia and Naples, the Pope and the Duke of Parma have become allies. You have chased the English from Livorno, Genoa and Corsica. The French flag waves for the first time upon the Adriatic, opposite to Macedon, the native country of Alexander. Still higher destinies await you. I know that you will not prove unworthy of them. Of all the enemies that conspired to stifle the Republic in its birth, the Austrian Emperor alone remains before you. This prince is in the pay of the merchants of London. His only desire, his only policy, is that of his treacherous paymasters, who, impervious to the evils of war, smile with satisfaction on the misfortunes of the continent. To obtain peace, we must seek it in the heart of the hereditary states of the House of Austria. You will there find a brave people, whose religion and customs you will respect, and whose property you will hold sacred. Remember that it is liberty you carry to that brave nation. You will bring them freedom." In early March, Archduke Charles, brother of the Emperor of Austria, was entrusted with command of the Austrian army. 2 years younger than Napoleon, he is regarded as a military prodigy. Napoleon had a high opinion of him, and later said, "He is a man whose conduct can never attract blame. His soul belongs to the heroic age, but his heart to that of gold. More than all, he is a good man, and that includes everything when said of a prince." Archduke Charles had defeated the armies of both General Jourdan and Moreau in Germany, but he fails to restore morale. He does not have enough troops or time. In command of an army of 50,000 Austrians, another 40,000 from all over the empire were on the march to join him, which would give him a potential 90,000 troops against the French. Napoleon, through reinforcements from France and Italy, only had a force of 50,000 men to march into Austria. He had to leave 20,000 behind to keep Italy quiet and to watch over the neutrality of the Italian states. On the 10th of March, Napoleon goes on the offensive. He sends Joubert to invade the Tyrol, Massena to advance up the Piave Valley, while he leads the bulk of the army on the most direct road to Vienna. The Austrians have hastily retreated 40 miles back to the eastern banks of the Tagliamento River, where Archduke Charles plans to fight a delaying action. Napoleon now had a fine army, and he led it confidently to meet the scattered and demoralized enemy. At 9 a.m. on the 10th of March, the French army arrive at the riverbank. Here they found the river wide and gravelly, with the Austrians drawn up on the opposite plain, their artillery placed to sweep the whole of it with grape shot. and on their two wings were large cavalry squadrons, ready to charge on the French if they attempted to cross. Seeing all this, Napoleon ordered his troops to withdraw beyond the enemy's fire and to prepare for breakfast. Weapons were laid aside, fires kindled, kettles boiling, and groups passed around bread and meat. Archduke Charles, seeing that Napoleon had decided to refresh his troops, also withdrew his forces to their camps. But when all was quiet, suddenly the trumpets sounded the prearranged signal, and the French sprang to arms, formed in battle array, and plunged into the river with the water up to their shoulders. Before the Austrians had time to recover, half of the French were across the river. General Bernadotte unsheathed his sabre and cried to his troops, "Soldiers of Sambre et Meuse, the army of Italy salutes you," and his men surged forwards. The Austrian line was smashed, with Bernadotte surrounding and capturing 2,000 of them. Archduke Charles ordered a cavalry charge, but it was pummeled by Murat's cavalry. The Austrians retreated in disarray, awaiting the arrival of more reinforcements. The rest of the French river crossing was not without incident. Napoleon reported to the Directory that a brave drummer in danger of drowning was saved by a vivandière who was an excellent swimmer. I rewarded her by hanging my own golden chain around her neck. Napoleon himself almost met the same fate. He insisted on crossing the river, which he did not think very deep, in his carriage, but when his horses stumbled, he came very close to drowning. The French pursuit continued, with Massena covering Napoleon's northern flank, until the Austrians are driven to the foot of the mountains, in a region of almost perpetual snow, and pursued up them. Napoleon's troops outmarch and outfight the Austrians at every turn. Massena arrives at the summit of Mount Tarvis in time to block the Austrians' retreat. They make a desperate stand, but are again beaten. Many were left dead on the ice, half buried in the snow. In 3 days of fighting, the French have taken another 3,000 prisoners. Many of the Austrians threw away their weapons and escaped over the mountain crags, having lost a fourth of their numbers. The French pursue vigorously until both forces at last arrived in the valley below. The Alps were now passed, and the French were in Austria, ready to march on the capital of Vienna. After occupying Klagenfurt, the capital of Carinthia, Napoleon delivered a proclamation to the Austrian people. The French army has not come to your country to conquer it, or to make any changes to your religion, your morals, or your customs. It is the friend of all nations. The Austrians were civil towards the French, and provided them with all the supplies they needed. The French troops were on their best behaviour, and nothing was taken from the locals without ample compensation. During his triumphant march, Napoleon showed his desire for peace by sending a letter to Archduke Charles. General-in-Chief, brave soldiers, while they make war, desire peace. Has not this war already continued 6 years? Have we not slain enough of our fellow men? Have we not inflicted enough woes upon suffering humanity? It demands peace. Upon all sides, Europe, which took up arms against the French Republic, has laid them aside. Your nation alone remains hostile, and blood is about to flow more copiously than ever. This 6th campaign has begun with sinister omens. Whatever may be its result, many thousands of men on the one side and the other will perish. And after all, we must come to an arrangement, for everything has an end, even the passion of hatred. You, General, who by birth approach so near the throne, and are above all the little passions which too often inflame ministers and governments, are you resolved to deserve the title of benefactor of humanity and of the real saviour of Austria? Do not imagine that I deny the possibility of saving Austria by force of arms, but even in such an event, your country will not be the less ravaged. As for myself, if the overture which I have the honour to make shall be the means of saving a single life, I shall be more proud of the civic crown, which I shall be conscious of having deserved, than of all the melancholy glory which military success can confer. But Archduke Charles did not have the authority to make peace, and sent in his reply, "In the duty assigned to me, there is no power either to scrutinize the causes or to terminate the duration of the war. I am not invested with any authority in that respect, and therefore cannot enter into any negotiation for peace." As his peace proposals had been rejected, Napoleon pressed on. At last, the French approached another mountain range called the Stypian Alps. Here, at the gorge of Neumarkt, the Austrians made another desperate effort, but they were then beaten at Hunsmarkt and driven back beyond Semmering. Napoleon had now reached Leoben, where he stopped to gather his forces. From the hills around the city, with his telescope, he could see the distant spires of Vienna. But his situation was more precarious than it seemed. The other French armies were only just crossing the Rhine, while his supply lines were overextended and vulnerable. Napoleon was now 300 miles from Milan and 600 miles from Paris. Never before had a French army penetrated so deep into Austria. Vienna was all but defenceless, and its court thrown into chaos. The Danube was covered with boats, carrying the riches of the city and terrified aristocrats out of the reach of danger, while the Austrian Emperor himself evacuated his children to Hungary. Among them was his eldest daughter, a blue-eyed 6-year-old called Marie-Louise, who no one could have possibly suspected would one day marry Napoleon and become his empress. Vienna prepared to make a stand. Fortifications were repaired and a militia organised and drilled. To gain more time, Archduke Charles sent a flag of truce to Napoleon, requesting an armistice for 24 hours. But Napoleon was too wary to be caught in the trap, and replied that moments were now precious, and that they could fight and negotiate at the same time. Napoleon then issued another proclamation to the Austrian people, assuring them that he was not fighting for conquest, but for peace, and that the Austrian government, bribed by English gold, was waging an unjust war against France. The people of Austria now began to clamour for peace. Archduke Charles urged his brother, the Emperor, to make it, declaring that the empire could no longer be saved by the army. Austrian ambassadors were hastily sent to settle the basis of peace, and implored an armistice from Napoleon of 5 days to settle the preliminaries. The Austrians knew that the war was lost, and they also knew that Napoleon could now conquer their empire within his grasp. But Napoleon did not do so. He wrote in his reply to the requested armistice, "In the present state of our military affairs, a suspension of hostilities must be very seriously adverse to the interests of the French army. But if, by such a sacrifice, that peace, which is so desirable and so essential to the happiness of the people, can be secured, I shall not regret consenting to your desires." The French Republic often expressed to His Majesty the Emperor its desire to put an end to this cruel fight. It persists in the same feelings, and I do not doubt, after the conference that only I have the honour to have with you, that soon peace will be concluded between His Majesty and the French Republic. Less than a week later, 2 Austrian generals arrived at Napoleon's headquarters as the Emperor's representatives, announcing his wish for peace, though he really had no other option. Napoleon granted them the armistice. Later, Napoleon would be criticised by the Directory for having stopped short in his conquest of Austria, which was still a powerful enemy for the French Republic, and could have been, in their opinion, easily brought down to its knees. Napoleon lodged in the bishop's residence, and it was Holy Week. To their amazement, the Austrians could celebrate it in the midst of a French army that respected their religious rituals. They had heard of how the French apparently massacred priests and burned churches. That April, negotiations with what Napoleon called this insolent and arrogant court began with the Austrian diplomat Gallo pedantically demanding that the pavilion where they were to take place be officially declared neutral ground. Napoleon was happy to concede the point, but as he dryly explained to the Directory, "This neutral ground is surrounded on all sides by the French army and is in the middle of our tents." Gallo then stated that by Article 1 of the treaty, the Emperor of Austria offered to recognise the existence of the French Republic. Up until now, he had insisted that the French Republic was a totally illegitimate government, but Napoleon clearly thought that it was not now in the defeated Austrian Emperor's place to recognise that by which he had been beaten. Napoleon leapt to his feet. "Strike that out," he demanded. "This is a clause fit only for the blind. The French Republic is like the sun in heaven, so much the worse for those who do not see it and derive the benefit of it. We French are masters in our own house, and can choose whatever government we please, and no one else has any say in the matter." Gallo persevered, clearly thinking he was making a concession, when he repeated that Austria would recognise the French Republic, on condition that it preserved the same etiquette as the King of France had, which allowed Napoleon to make the irreproachably republican remark that since the French were completely indifferent to everything concerning etiquette, it wouldn't matter for us to adopt the article. In their settlement, neither Austria nor France showed much regard for the minor states. The policy of the Directory was that Austria must give France both the Rhine frontier and Belgium, which was formerly an Austrian possession that had been conquered by France a few years earlier. These were the two essential terms, in exchange for which northern Italy might well have to be handed back to Austria. The Austrian position was that they couldn't possibly let France have their former territory of Milan, which protected her vulnerable southern frontier. But Napoleon realised that he was still in a tight spot, alone in Austria with a small army. It was in a last bid to make peace that he threw down on the peace table a new card, Venice. That would compensate Austria for the loss of Milan. It was true that Venice was not yet his, but the Venetian nobles despised the French and their ideas, and Napoleon believed that a showdown with them was inevitable. Napoleon offered to allow Austria to take under her protection many of the Venetian states. His offer created a sensation, and the Austrians at once accepted it. After just 5 days of negotiation, on the 18th of April 1797, Napoleon signed the preliminary terms of Leoben. Insisting on speed, Napoleon didn't wait for the envoys to arrive from Paris, but signed the treaty in his own name. By doing so, he placed himself on an equal footing with the Emperor of Austria, which was recognized by his government. After 5 years of war against France, peace was made. Napoleon's dazzling march into Austria has brought the war of the First Coalition to an end. Only England remained at war with France. Napoleon's reading of Venice's anti-French feeling proved correct. Venice was once again treacherous. Rumours that Napoleon had been defeated in Austria filled the air, even that he'd been taken prisoner and that his army was destroyed. Despite Napoleon's previous warnings that he would seize Venice if they betrayed their neutrality, as soon as his back was turned, the Venetians raised the cry of death to the French, fomenting revolt among the peasants, whipped up by the priests, who massacred isolated French nationals. They killed over 400 unarmed Frenchmen in the streets and attacked the troops in the garrison, even bursting into the hospitals and daggering the wounded in their beds. A French warship that was being pursued by the Austrian fleet sought refuge in Venice's port, whose artillery then opened fire on them, killing the French captain and part of his crew and seizing the ship for Venice's navy, while the survivors who managed to swim to shore were slaughtered. When Napoleon learned of all this, he was furious. Having contemplated dealing with Venice at leisure, he then decided to act immediately. When they heard that Napoleon was in fact returning to Italy as the victor, not the vanquished, the Venetian government was predictably terrified and sent envoys with bribes to try to pacify him. He listened to their awkward apologies and their offer of millions of gold. Then Napoleon exploded, "If you could offer me the treasures of Peru, if you could cover your whole country with gold, it would not atone for the French blood which has been treacherously spilled. You have murdered my children. The Lion of St. Mark must lick the dust. Go." To another group of Venetian envoys sent, Napoleon launched into a tirade. "Are the prisoners at liberty? I will have them all who are in prison for their political beliefs. I will go myself to destroy your dungeons on the Bridge of Tears. Opinion shall be free. I will have no inquisition. If all the prisoners are not set at instant liberty, the English envoy dismissed, the people disarmed, I declare instant war. I might have gone to Vienna. I have concluded a peace with the Emperor. I have 80,000 men, 20 gunboats. I will hear of no Inquisition, and no Senate either. I will be an Attila to the state of Venice." In their panic, the Venetians sent enormous sums to Paris and managed to bribe the Directory to be more lenient. Accordingly, they sent orders to Napoleon to spare the ancient Senate and Venice's ruling aristocracy. But Napoleon, who had now come to privately despise the corrupt and weak Directory, and knowing that he now had powers which they could not shake, paid no attention to their orders. Instead, Napoleon marched into the territories of the Doge, and his cannon was soon reverberating across Venice's lagoons. The Doge gathered the Grand Council and proposed the surrender of their government to Napoleon to be remodelled according to his will. It was also suggested that they should again try to corrupt Napoleon with a colossal fortune. It was a solution that had often worked for Venice over the centuries, but they already knew that Napoleon was incorruptible. He had already rejected with scorn a huge bribe offered by the Duke of Modena, and was to reject one far more princely offered by Austria. While Venice's council was deliberating, uproar and revolt was heard in the streets. The aristocratic party and the pro-French Republicans clashed furiously, with shots being fired beneath the very windows of the council chamber. Then 3,000 French soldiers crossed the lagoons in boats and entered Venice. All that remained for the Venetian oligarchs was to accept the inevitable, to surrender their power, and to disappear. On the 12th of May, the Grand Council surrendered its sovereignty by 512 votes to 17. So ended the 1,200-year history of the serene Republic of Venice. A few days later, the French army entered the city without a blow, setting up camp in St. Mark's Square. Venice's treachery had given Napoleon the pretext he needed to seize it, and eventually hand it over to Austria, as secretly agreed in the peace treaty. Still, Napoleon had some pangs of conscience. When the noble Venetian Dandolo pled for his state's independence, Napoleon grew agitated, and was even seen to tear up. Before Austria got her hands on Venice, Napoleon acted quickly in trying to reform it, immediately throwing open the prison doors to all persecuted for their political opinions. He pardoned all the offences against himself and abolished the aristocracy, setting up a democratic government on France's model to represent all classes in Venice. But the French presence was a double-edged sword. The famous horses of St. Mark were among Venice's many treasures, including 20 works of art by Titian, Bellini and Veronese that were sent to the Louvre in Paris to join its rapidly expanding Italian collection. As they were paraded through the streets, the crowds cheered, "Rome is no more in Rome, it is all in Paris." In the face of powerful armies, Napoleon had travelled hundreds of miles, crossing rivers and the Alps, dragging his artillery through snow 3 feet deep, scattered the armies of Austria to the winds, and imposed peace on them, recrossed the Alps, laid Venice low, and set up a popular government. All this he had done in 6 weeks. The Italian campaign was over. In less than a year, a nameless young general of 26, who had never before fought a pitched battle, with 30,000 ragged and half-starved troops, had crept along the Mediterranean, crossed the Apennines and the Alps, defeated the Piedmontese army, and no less than 6 Austrian armies, one after the other. Napoleon had won a dozen landmark battles, which outshone all the combined French victories in Italy over the past 300 years. With a marching army of never more than 44,000 men, Napoleon had defeated forces totaling 4 times that number, and killed, wounded or captured 120,000 Austrian soldiers. 18 months earlier, he had been poor and obscure, writing melancholy essays on suicide. Now, the name of Bonaparte was famous across Europe. He had completed what he had set out to do, and more. Napoleon had now travelled the whole of Italy, forced its hostile states to respect the French Republic, wrung peace treaties from the Pope and the kings of Piedmont and Naples, and defeated in every conceivable set of military circumstances some of Austria's most famous generals, as well as outwitted the emperor's brother, Archduke Charles, and humbled the Austrian emperor as an emperor had rarely been humbled before. Napoleon had preserved his army, dumbfounded his opponents, and astonished Europe. The famous Russian general Suvorov, who would soon try to emulate him, wrote gushingly to his nephew, "Oh, how this young Bonaparte manoeuvres! He is a hero, he is a miracle hero, he is a sorcerer. He conquers both nature and people. He walked around the Alps as if they did not exist at all. He hid their formidable peaks in his pocket, and hid his army in the right sleeve of his uniform. It seemed that the enemy then only noticed his soldiers when he sent them, like Jupiter his lightning, sowing fear everywhere, and striking the scattered crowds of Austrians and Piedmontese. Oh, how he marches! He cut the Gordian knot of tactics. Not caring about the number, he attacks the enemy everywhere, and smashes him completely. He knows the irresistible force of the onslaught." Napoleon had no single secret to his success. The qualities which made the Italian campaign successful were varied, and were the same qualities seen in all of Napoleon's campaigns. Why he always, or nearly always, emerged victorious from a battlefield. The first quality was discipline and incentives to bravery. Napoleon's own confidence and courage inspired his troops to such a degree that their morale, perhaps more than their tactics and strategy, was the secret of Napoleon's success as a general, which was all the more remarkable as the morale of this army was non-existent when he'd first taken command. Their new general's reforms, his firm stand against pillage, his swift and uncompromising retaliation to law-breaking counted for much in introducing discipline and spirit to the army. But more important was Napoleon's hold on the psyches and the psychology of the men in uniform. He took an army materially and morally impoverished, and in less than a month had turned it into one of the finest fighting forces of the century, and the means Napoleon used were not material, but psychological. Napoleon knew not to confuse soldiers' gripes with their actual state of mind, their mood with their obedience, and their appearances with their battle readiness. As Napoleon concisely put it, moral force rather than numbers decides victory. The moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Above all, Napoleon believed in maintaining a strong esprit de corps. Although this was intangible, he knew an army that had it could work wonders. A decade later, he was to write to his brother Joseph, "Remember, it takes 10 campaigns to create esprit de corps, which can be destroyed in an instant." Napoleon formulated a number of ways to raise and maintain morale, some taken from his reading of ancient history, others developed on campaign. One was to foster the soldier's strong sense of identity and pride with his regiment. Napoleon approved the right of one, the 57th, to stitch onto their colours the words, "The terrible 57th, which nothing can stop." It joined other heroic regiments, known by their nicknames, such as the Brave, the 18th of the line, the Incomparable, 9th Legere, and 1 against 10 for the 84th of the line. Plays, songs, operas, arias, proclamations, festivals, ceremonies, symbols, standards, and medals. Napoleon instinctively understood what soldiers wanted, and he gave it to them. And for well over a decade, he was going to give them what they wanted most of all: victory. Napoleon had learnt and put into practice many essential leadership lessons from Julius Caesar, especially his habit of admonishing troops he considered to have fallen below expectations. But far more often, of course, Napoleon lavished praise. A man does not have himself killed for a halfpence a day, or for a petty distinction. You must speak to the soul in order to electrify him. Napoleon's proclamations to his troops were posted up in camp on billboards and were widely read. He enjoyed firing off a series of statistics, telling the troops how many victories they had won, how quickly, and how many fortresses, generals, cannons, flags, and prisoners they had captured. Napoleon flattered his troops with references to the ancient world, though only a minority would have been familiar with the classics, and when, with a special flourish, he compared them with eagles, or told them how much their families and neighbours would honour them, he captured the minds of his men, often for life. The avalanche of praise Napoleon often lavished on his troops was in sharp contrast to the acerbic tone of his letters to generals, ambassadors, councillors, ministers, and indeed, sometimes his own family. Severe to the officers, kindly to the men, was his mantra. On campaign, Napoleon showed an approachability that endeared him to his troops, and those who joked or shouted good-naturedly from the ranks would often be rewarded with a quip. As Napoleon later told General Brune, "You know what words can do to soldiers." One night, Napoleon, in disguise, checked up on some of his soldiers posted as guards to see if they were being vigilant enough. One soldier, stationed at a crossroads, had been given orders not to let anyone pass. When Napoleon approached, the soldier, not knowing who he was, ordered him back with his bayonet. "I'm a general officer," Napoleon explained, "going the rounds to ascertain if all is safe." "I don't care," the soldier replied. "My orders are to let no one go by, and if you were the little corporal himself, you should not pass." As a result, Napoleon was forced to turn back. The next day, he asked about this soldier, and hearing a good report of him, called for him and raised him to the rank of officer. Moreover, Napoleon also abolished the punishment of flogging throughout his armies, then common practice in Europe at the time. Instead of the lash, I introduced the stimulus of honour. Whatever debases a man cannot be serviceable. What honour can a man possibly have who is flogged before his comrades? When a soldier has been debased by stripes, he cares little for his own reputation or for the honour of his country. After an action, I assembled the officers and soldiers, and asked who had proved themselves heroes. Such of them as were able to read and write, I promoted. Those who were not, I ordered to study 5 hours a day until they had learned a sufficiency, and then promoted them. Thus, I substituted honour and emulation for terror and the lash. Napoleon's soldiers were free to put their cases forward for being awarded medals, promotions, and even pensions, which he would grant them once he had checked the truth of their claims. He personally read petitions from the ranks and granted as many as he could. Baron Bourset, who served Napoleon on many campaigns, recalled that he interrogated and decided at once. If it was a refusal, the reasons were explained in a manner which softened the disappointment. Napoleon's relations with his troops were not conveyed through a steep hierarchy of social class or convention. Such accessibility to their commander-in-chief is impossible to imagine in the British army of the time or in the Austrian army of Archduke Charles. But in Republican France, it was an invaluable way of keeping in touch with the needs and concerns of his men. During Napoleon's military reviews, which could last for up to 5 hours, he would cross-examine his soldiers about their food, uniforms, shoes, general health, amusements, and regularity of pay, and he expected to be told the truth. He told the 17th Demi-Brigade, "Conceal from me none of your wants. Suppress no complaints you have to make of your superiors. I'm here to do justice to all, and the weaker party is especially entitled to my protection." The idea that the little corporal was on their side against les gros bonnets, the big hats, was generally held throughout the army. As Napoleon himself remarked, a man who has no consideration for the needs of his men ought never to be given command. Proper care of the wounded was a particular concern, humanity aside, partly because he needed them to return to the ranks as quickly as possible, but also because he knew how important prompt medical treatment was for morale. Troops going into battle wanted to know that if the worst came to the worst, they would be looked after and had a good chance of survival. One aide-de-camp remembered, if he happened to meet with convoys of wounded, he stopped them, informed himself of their condition, of their sufferings, of the actions in which they had been wounded, and never left them without consoling them by his words, or making them sharers in his bounty. By contrast, Napoleon regularly upbraided doctors, most of whom he thought were charlatans, when, as so often during this time period, they provided inadequate medical care. Turning to Napoleon's tactics, he was always the one to make the first move in battle, and so kept the Austrians off guard, having to fight at the time and place of his choosing. The French outflanked and threatened communications lines, and crossed rivers with only the materials they could scrounge up locally. Yet, Napoleon could not possibly have done this alone. He had superb generalship in his different divisions, notably Massena. The second quality that Napoleon had insisted on was unity of command. He could use large bodies of men, separated by a distance of hundreds of miles, as components of a single plan. This also had a healthy effect on morale. His troops knew that one competent man was controlling their marches, supplies, and battle formations, and that they would not be sacrificed to petty squabbles between generals with equal powers. Without Napoleon's complete control over his commanders and every element of his army, his willingness to take breathtaking risks also counted for something. In each of his major battles, at Lodi as well as Rivoli, Napoleon had sent a small part of his army to surprise the enemy from the side or rear. Sometimes this flanking movement was only slight, but almost always it was enough to shock and demoralize the enemy. Napoleon might have been the underdog with fewer men on paper, but by concentrating his men against one part of the enemy, he almost always contrived to become numerically superior at one time in one place. Such concentration was achieved by their astonishing forced marches, thousands of miles up and down Italy, over snow-bound mountains and sun-baked plains, from Nice to Verona, from Ancona to Semmering. Napoleon flouted his enemies' reliance on the rules of 18th century warfare, mainly just by speeding everything up. This was often enough to unsettle them and threaten disarray to their complex formations, which, on a battlefield, could turn into a chaotic rout with the speed of lightning. At Napoleon's hands, the Austrians were force-fed a steady diet of his floutings of convention, and uncertain how to respond, they grew discouraged. But speed in the field was only an aspect of that speed in Napoleon's own body and mind, which had already been noticed. Napoleon himself summed it up better than anyone in a letter to the Directory. "If I have won successes over forces very much superior to my own, it is because, confident that you trusted me, my troops have moved as rapidly as my thoughts." In what Napoleon did better than the Austrian commanders, a trait that stands out was his ability to swiftly sift through all possible scenarios. Quick perception and discernment, followed by quick decision-making, then quick order-giving and acute surveillance. Napoleon simply saw a potential weakness in the line of battle, or a geographical quirk in terrain, quicker than others did. He simply analysed faster. There is only one favourable moment in war. The talent consists in knowing how to seize it. Napoleon's older aristocratic opponents were pros with solid reputations, but war was merely their job, not their self-expression or their meaning, nor their fortune and their future. And so, while they toiled, they were not indefatigable. Unlike Napoleon, they were not able to subsist on a few hours of sleep day after day and still function. They did not exist on a permanent knife edge, in a state bordering on nervous exhaustion, even if hidden behind a facade of cool composure. War was an important job for them, but not their titanic personal struggle, the imposition of their very selves. A commander had to show various kinds of courage, but the greatest was not physical bravery. It was moral courage, accepting responsibility for decisions that risked many lives, perhaps even a whole nation. As Napoleon put it, war is a serious game in which a man risks his reputation, his troops, and his country. A sensible man will search himself to know whether or not he is fitted for that trade. The first quality for a commander-in-chief is a cool head to receive a correct impression of things. He should not allow himself to be confused by either good or bad news. He who cannot look over a battlefield with a dry eye causes the death of many men uselessly. Napoleon was able to adapt himself to the hell of the battlefield, reacting rationally to whatever was happening around him, amidst the gigantic and distracting presence of suffering, death, and destruction.